that it was Mother's Day until about 3 hours ago. I'm going to be completely honest. I am not one who pays attention to those kinds of things, and my mother has never made a huge production out of it, but now I will remember to call her today. But even so, it turns out that my sermon today is very much inspired by my mother. I call this kind of lessons from my mother as we look at what I'm going to talk about today, because what I have just read you is one of the more extreme stories in the New Testament, right? It's not often in the New Testament that we see people dropping dead like this. It might be more common in the Old Testament, perhaps. And I just want to start with a little public service announcement. I can't kill you for not donating to the church. I just want that made clear. I have no connections in that way. So what is this story about, besides two people dropping dead? Is it because did they drop dead because they were greedy? Because they hoarded all their money? Did they drop dead because they lied? That seems like the clearest two reasons at first blush, right? But perhaps it's not just about greed, and it's not just about dishonesty. Perhaps it's about what they become when they start working together. Perhaps it's when those traits come together to form something else, something, by the way, that my mother taught me to smell from 500 paces, and that is pretense, pretension, pretentiousness, those words, right? I would argue that Ananias and Sapphira were pretentious, and that began their problems. I also believe pretension indicates kinds of personal suffering, so I'm going to show a little sympathy for these two people, because this isn't just a story about greed or dishonesty. This is a story about the largeness of what they did beyond just the simple lie. So the first question is, what is pretense? Well, I am very averse to using definitions in public addresses, but I guess this warrants one, so I will do so. A pretense is a false display or claim, presenting oneself as having qualities, importance, knowledge, or status one doesn't actually possess. It is the performance of something inauthentic in order to impress or to deceive. Performance is the through line of pretension. It is a performative way of living. So, what do pretentious people look like? Well, you all know what they look like. We all know what they look like because we all have been one at some point or another. I know I have. We know these people. They're the people who like to drop names a lot, right? They like to talk about important people that they know and important things that they have done, who they know and how they know them. They turn simple things into complex tasks. Every simple thing they do is a victory over some complex thing they had to conquer, right? And so they use jargon, and they use obscure language, and they use kinds of symbolic languages that other people might not know on purpose. They seek approval endlessly. They pretend to be indifferent to the need for approval, but they crave it desperately. They insist that there is a right way and a wrong way to do stuff. There's a right way to appreciate art, and there's a wrong way to appreciate art. There's a right way to taste wine, and there's a wrong way to taste wine. There's a right way to pray, and there's a wrong way to pray. There's a right way to be Christian, and there's a wrong way to be Christian. And anyone who does not follow their particular prescribed way of doing things is automatically disqualified from the conversation as a dum-dum. Under scrutiny, when these people are challenged, when their honesty is called into question or their motivation is called into question, pay attention to this, because Ananias and Sapphira may fall into this. They lie. They lie blatantly, or become deliberately vague or dismissive, or lie. They just lie. And they do it all for one thing. Pretentious people live to protect status. They live to protect the idea that they have status, some kind of status in society, because underneath their entire being is status anxiety. They live in a constant fear of not being enough, not being important enough. It is almost always a defense mechanism that becomes a way of tormenting other people. It is an armor that covers insecurity. Why does it matter now? Why does it matter to this story? Who cares if Ananias and Sapphira held money back? Who cares if they told a lie? Let's get past the extremities of them dropping dead for a minute and talk about what the actual crime here is. What the actual pretense problem was in this particular case. We just learned last week that there was a particular way that the disciples had formed their economy, that there is a particular way they had decided to handle money and possessions. They were forming a society based on a radical sense of shared common community. They shared everything, all their money, all their property. They owned everything together. That was their basic way of existing. And that meant, by definition, that everyone who wanted to enter that community had to include their own wealth into the community pot. You could not withhold to be part of this community. It was fundamentally dishonest, of course. So selfishness and pretense and dishonesty, these things become enemies of the kind of sharing and radicalized community that the disciples were actually trying to form. They become such strong enemies of them that we've never been able to form this community again. So why does pretense affect communities? What does it do to them? Well, it's interesting. Pretense creates something that most people don't even notice it's doing. It creates instant hierarchies where there should be mutuality. What does that mean? It means it inserts implicit rankings into social structures. It means every person fits into a place on the ladder of their perceived structure. By withholding money, Ananias and Sapphira automatically made themselves richer than everyone else by default. They created a status that was not supposed to exist. It was pretense. They had promised that they were signed up for this community, this radical sharing, this commonality. That was the pretense. They said they were all in, and they weren't. Pretense is about being inauthentic. Pretense makes authenticity unsafe in communities. Because if everybody is acting, what is the point of being real? If we're going to tolerate pretension and reward it the way we do in our nation, frankly, the performance starts to matter more than the actual meaning, the actual work, or the actual value of anything. Nothing has value. And it creates an environment where people are afraid to ask questions because they might look unsophisticated or stupid. The entire community, once pretense enters its doors, begins to shift toward image management, impression management, advertising, public image, all that crap. The entire community begins to change the way it exists. Ananias and Sapphira would always know they had more money than others. They would always know they were safer than others. They would always know that they had leverage in that culture. They would always know it. That is not collaboration. Pretentious communities are also, by definition, exclusionary. They have to be. Maybe not obviously so, of course. I mean, every church I've ever been to suggests that they love everyone. I've never heard one say they didn't, even when it's not true, right? We love everyone, right? Except maybe these people or that person or, whatever. The number of religious pretensions that exist are so wide and large that I will not list them here because you want to go home, I'm assuming, at some point, right? Lots of religious pretensions exist. We use words like welcome so freely and with abandon, and we never actually mean it. We talk about being against war. We talk about nonviolence. We talk about the peaceful, loving Jesus Christ while we are bombing schools and accepting violence every single day it's just a matter of living. Pretentious people cannot be trusted. True community requires the kind of vulnerability that allows us to be honest with one another, a willingness to see and seek out one another and our truth at its best and at its worst. Not as judgment, but to love each other back to wholeness again. You cannot know a pretentious person because no one knows them. When we become pretentious, we are not true anymore. We are not ourselves anymore. And true and honest community requires us to be who we are. Pretentious communities begin to decide that certain people don't look right, don't love right, don't vote right. And when a community's purpose becomes managing its public image, managing its own little hierarchies and its own little hypocrisies that are spreading out into the world, they stop being the church. They stop asking why we are here. Because it doesn't matter anymore. It just matters that people see that we are here. We cannot be the church anymore if we are only performing our faith. Faith must be worked. It must be done. It must be walked and talked and acted out. Pretension is contempt. It is contempt for others and for oneself, and it is contempt for God. Community does not, cannot, and will not thrive where contempt lives beneath its surface. Now, I said earlier, I feel for pretentious people because I've been accused of being one. And I'm sure I have been on more than one occasion in my life. And I don't think that all pretension comes from places of evil, and I don't think that it's always used to manipulate or hurt people. Pretentious people don't think they're enough. That is their fundamental problem, and so they need to have more always. They perform because they feel insufficient. It is that simple. They build masks of shame, not always consciously, and at some point they decided that the things they care about, the things they like, the things, their tastes and their background and their social standings are not good enough. And so they overcorrected and invented new ones. It is armor, mistaken for identity. Pretentious people see the world as a marketing ploy. And it asks us to stop living from inside out and start living from outside in. St. Benedict would have understood this as a violation of what he called humilitas, humility, the understanding of our honest relationship with one another, self-knowledge, the knowledge of self that allows us to stand in true relationship, in honest relationship with one another. A humble person knows who they are without inflation or deflation. They show up for real. Pretentious people never show up. And when it's allowed to creep into culture and community, the contempt, the disdain for differences, for the ordinary, for regular people, begins to leak outward. People outside a church can smell pretension. They can smell it from 50 miles away. The way they can smell hypocrisy that comes from the church. Because they've been in the churches. Every eye roll they see at what they are wearing. Every judgment they sense at how they look or who they love. Maybe they're not rich enough to be in this church. Maybe they're not smart enough to be in this church. Maybe there is something about them that just isn't enough to be here, and that is unacceptable. Unacceptable in church communities. It has no place inside the house of God, because this kind of pretense becomes the hate, the bigotries, the sexisms, the racisms, the phobias that begin to tear societies apart. Is it worth a death sentence? I don't know. I'm not minimizing the shock of this story. I'm not going to excuse the fact that we just heard about 2 people dropping dead. It's a shocking story. In fact, I'm going to let you sit with it. I'm not even going to take it away from you. Because we don't know exactly how much pretension costs a community until we start seeing it. And we are beginning to see it, folks. We are beginning to see it in our nation and our communities. What does it mean when the leaders of a nation are performing and not caring? What does it mean when the leaders of a nation are performing and not actually doing their jobs? What does it mean when the leaders of a nation will give you the pretense of caring about you while destroying you economically, culturally, artistically? When a nation is run by performance and not depth and not intellect, not meaning or not value, it becomes a pretentious nation, a distrusted nation, a nation that cannot tell the truth because it is too busy performing. And we cannot allow our communities to become places of lies, places of pretension. We cannot allow our churches to become places of hypocrisy where they don't mean what they say and they don't do what they say they will do. Pretense removes our integrity as religious people, and without integrity in this world, the church is useless. The church has to be trusted. We have a sacred trust with the communities around us. We believe life to be sacred, humanity to be sacred. The church is a place where we must promote trust and love and grace and mercy, to welcome people, to heal people, to help people, to feed people, to clothe people. All of it without pretense and without judgment, because Jesus never made you fill out a form to make sure you qualified for care. And Jesus never asked what your sin was before he healed you. The church has to call things out as they are. It has to call things out for what they are. It has to denounce the very concept of pretense in our social structures and replace it with justice and with equity and with a society that cares about each other the way God intended. Because as the old movie line says, an ounce of pretension is worth a pound of manure. Amen.